they can kind of find it, hopefully that little go live sticker will
Sure.
kind of go live a little bit earlier than we need it to.
Sure.
That's all good enough.
Sure.
Kind of go live a little bit earlier than we need it to. And I'm going to mute myself. No, I'm not going to mute that yet. So Mark, I think we're going to do the same thing this week where we just have you give your lecture, and then I will come on at the end and ask any questions that people put in the chat box.
Sure. Sure, that'll work.
Okay.
All set?
Yep.
Oh.
Well, it's 3:01, so we might as well get started. I'm just going to mute myself, and then you can get going, Mark.
Good enough. Good enough. Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth and final presentation of this four-talk set commemorating the 100th anniversary of American Women and the Right to Vote. This year, August 26th to be exact, marks the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. The interesting thing here about this amendment is the terminology itself. It is not much different than an amendment that appeared 50 years earlier, the 15th, giving the black man the right to vote. And the 19th Amendment, as put forth, reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. But when you hearken back to the 15th Amendment, ratified, as I mentioned earlier, in 1870, it reads as such, Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Keep in mind, black men were coming out of slavery with the end of the Civil War just 5 years previous. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by the appropriate legislation. Now, the terminology here is they're almost the same terminology, except one is for gender, one is for color or race, if you want to go into that terminology of this. However, having said that, why did we get to this point? There's a lot more going on especially in the early part of the 20th century into the First World War with regards to how this 19th Amendment was actually ratified and the struggle that ensued for ratification. However, when you take a look going back to 1865, and in the previous talk that I gave on the women's suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement or the women's rights movement affiliated themselves with the American Anti-Suffrage Anti-Slave Association, and because the American abolitionist movement was not getting enough men. So how do you get more members? Maybe you appeal to women. The advantage here for women is that their message, getting it back into 1838, was not getting into the press. The editors, for the most part, were overwhelmingly men. However, once the women's suffrage movement, women's rights movement, became affiliated with the abolitionist movement, and many of these suffragettes were abolitionists. That needs to be understood, like Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony. But their message began to get into newspapers that supported the abolitionist movement. However, having said that, when the war is over, what need is there for an abolitionist movement? The reason for same has now been justified. The slavery has been ended, and the Southern aristocracy, the overseers of that American concentration camp system, have been defeated in a war. But the women's movement for voting, the women's movement for women's rights, continues. But now there is going to be a split here, and the abolitionists, for the crowning achievement here of their work in trying to overturn slavery, they want to get an amendment applied to the Constitution to get the black man to vote. Of course, part of this is the Republican Party. Some of these abolitionists are affiliating themselves with the Republican Party, which is a young party, and and this party, the Republican Party, is the party of the side that won the Civil War, the North, the Union. This is Lincoln's party, and they can take control of the nation's politics now if they can get 2 million black men to register and vote as Republicans. And so the urgency politically for Republicans to get the black man to vote is dire here for them to control what's going to be Reconstruction. And so the abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, are urging the women's suffrage movement to hold off wanting to get the woman's right to vote done as opposed to getting the black man done first. Now, this is going to cause a split in the women's movement. And Lucy Stone, Julia Howe will side reluctantly with the abolitionists and the Republicans. Folks like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will not. They will be holdouts. In fact, in 1865, they came out with a petition for universal suffrage. And this was sent to the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the first line reads, "The undersigned, women of the United States, respectfully ask an amendment of the Constitution shall prohibit the several states from disenfranchising any of their citizens on the ground of sex. And then when you get down near the end, there's a line that reads, therefore, as you are now amending the Constitution and in harmony with advancing civilization, placing new safeguards around the individual rights of 4 millions of emancipated slaves, we ask you to extend the right of suffrage to women, the only remaining class of disenfranchised citizens. Thus, fulfill your constitutional obligation to guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. Again, this leads to a split. Now, Stanton and Anthony are basing their argument here on two amendments. One is the 14th, the 13th, the other is the 15th. The 14th, 13th and 15th Amendment, 13th and 14th Amendment, sorry. The 13th Amendment, ratified 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Keep in mind, that not only applies to men, how about black women? There was a black woman's suffrage movement, and I'm going to get into that. Amendment 14. Now, this is the big one. This comes after the petition for universal suffrage, but Anthony and Stanton are going to extend their argument based on the 14th Amendment, and it reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens in the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And that's important, due process of law. Not deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are trying to make the point that, like liberated blacks, men and women of all colors, of all persuasions, are citizens. They're born here, they're citizens, they should enjoy the rights and privileges endowed in the American Constitution and Bill of Rights. But politics here intrudes, and you are going to see what was formed here, the American Equal Rights Association in 1866. This is going to split because some of these suffragettes will side with the abolitionists and Republicans, some will not. And Stanton and Anthony are going to help form an organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Lucy Stone and Julia Howe will help form an organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association. And the 15th Amendment, giving the black man the right to vote, will pass in 1870. However, what's interesting here, the African American suffrage efforts. There were such leading personalities here, such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Fanny Berrier Williams, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth. These ladies were also caught up in this agenda of getting the black woman the right to vote. Now, unfortunately, some of these ladies are going to side with the abolitionists and also with the Republicans. Unfortunate to the perspective that they're going to help split the movement. And they will actually side with the American Women's Suffrage Association. However, other ladies will side with the National Women's Suffrage Association, such ladies as Mary Ann Shadd Carey. Now, she's an important person. She sides with the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1878. And she is the second African-American woman to receive a degree from Howard University Law School. Now, this is a pretty intelligent lady here to side with the National Woman Suffrage Association, but in a way, it doesn't stop the split that has occurred here. Having said that, the post-Reconstruction era, once you get into 1878, and keep in mind, Reconstruction will be over by 1877, and the tensions between the two sides in the women's debate continue. Both sides, the National Woman Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association, they both agree they want the woman to have the right to vote. But on top of that, the American Woman Suffrage Association is trying to work state by state to try to get that amendment on the books. The National Woman Suffrage Association is working more from central authority here, Washington, D.C. However, at the same time, the National Woman Suffrage Association is paying attention to such issues as equal pay for equal work. How about when a woman gets a divorce, she gets the kids instead of an abusive husband? These are some of the issues they're working on. However, there will be an attempt in 1878, and this senator from California, his name is Aaron Sargent. Aaron Sargent is actually a friend of Susan B. Anthony's, and he tries to get draws up legislation, and he tries to get this passed in Congress. It will not pass. And even though Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and other leaders will testify before the Senate to get this bill ratified to give the women the right to vote, this legislation will die in 1887. But to add to this, women try to get the issue done in another way. Interesting here, in 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually tried to run for Congress. She won't get elected, but she tried to run for Congress. Let me see here. Oh, I'm sorry. Just a moment here. Oh, I lost my place here. Give me just a moment. Okay. All right, here we are here. Other women tried to run for Congress as well. A woman by the name of, oh boy, this is really, let me see here. Pardon me just one moment. Let me get back to this. Oh, I lost my place here, and I got to get it back. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that that attempt to get women the right to vote in 1887 failed. But in 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association will mend fences, and they will join to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. However, at this stage of the women's movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is actually becoming elderly at this point, as is Susan B. Anthony and all the other original class of women coming up for the women's rights movement. However, having said that, there are new women coming up, such as Carrie Chapman Catt. She will actually take over as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1900. Susan B. Anthony is already 80 years old. So Miss Catt, Carrie Chapman Catt, takes control of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now she's going to go a different route here. Keep in mind, by the end of the 19th century, women's clubs were forming, and many of these women's clubs, their members were middle class and up on the income brackets. And Carrie Chapman Catt thought that by affiliating with these women's clubs, obviously here the money becomes an issue, because money is that grease for the political wheels. But that also comes at a cost. Many of these women in the upper income brackets are going to be more conservative. Having said that as well, there's another issue here affecting the women's movement. Many women were not politically affiliated. You know, not as many women were openly excited about having the right to vote. Some women were dominated by their husbands. Some women are not as well educated. They are not politically savvy. So this was an issue. However, at the same time, movements like the Grange, the farmers' movement, had already supported the women's suffrage movement. The American Federation of Labor supports the women's suffrage movement. But then again, there's a pushback. The distillers and the brewers, they do not want women to get the right to vote. And the reason being is because they feel that if women get the right to vote, prohibition will become the law of the land. Of course, that's going to happen in 1919. Around the same time women get the right to vote. The clothing companies, the cotton mills, did not want the women to get the right to vote. This is especially true down south because of the cheap child labor. If women get the right to vote, motherhood, etc., they are not going to have access to such cheap labor. That is going to be an impediment to the women's right to vote. But at the same time here, you are seeing, as we get into the 19th century and getting closer to the First World War, that yes, new people are coming up. One of them is an Alice Paul. Alice Paul had been in England, and she is a more radical member of the suffragette movement. And she was in England. She is now back in the United States. And the National Association of Women's Suffrage Association was becoming a bit more conservative in its approach. It is not really militant, as opposed to Alice Paul, who is. And Alice Paul will try to increase the revolutionary aspects of the women's movement. And having said that, she will eventually form something known as the Congressional Union. This Congressional Union is interesting. Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913. And they try to pressure the federal government for action. Keep in mind, 1913 is important because that's the year Woodrow Wilson's going to take the oath of office for his first term as president. And so on March 3, 1913, this Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage is going to hold a march on March 3, 1913, the day before Wilson's inauguration. They have a procession of 5,000 participants, and it draws a crowd of 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. to watch this parade for women's rights. And so the Congression, in fact, in March 1917, the Congressional Union will form with the Women's Party of Western Voters to form what's known as the National Women's Party, NWP, which still exists, by the way, whose aggressive tactics included staging more radical acts of civil disobedience, controversial demonstrations to draw more attention to the women's suffrage issue. Of course, what helps too is the First World War, already starting in 1914. In fact, the same year the war starts, that constitutional amendment proposed by Aaron Sargent back in 1877, now known as by many of the women's rights in the women's rights movement, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was once sent to the Senate. it was rejected by the Senate, and it was rejected again in April 1917. April 1917 is important because that's the year America gets into the war. In fact, on July 4, 1917, the National Woman's Party took to the streets, figuring now war is a good way to get this done. And on July 4, 1917, the police will crack down in Washington, D.C. on these National Woman Party members, and they arrest 168 of them. And they will be sent to Lorton, Virginia, to a prison there. And some of these women, including Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, will go on a hunger strike and be force-fed. And many of these women were mistreated in the prisons. However, by 1918, with more men now being put into uniform, they are now going overseas. Women have to take up the slack. And as women begin to take up the slack, Woodrow Wilson is coming more and more around to the notion of granting women the right to vote. And so by 1918, Woodrow Wilson is on board with this. And between January 1918 and June 1919, in that year and a half period, the House and Senate voted on that federal amendment 5 times. Each vote was extremely close. Now, the section of the country in question here, the South. The South, Southern Democrats did not want women voting. However, on May 21, 1919, the amendment passed the House, 304 to 89. On June 4, it will go to the Senate. And the Senate, even though the Senate will overcome a Southern attempt to filibuster, 37 Republican senators joined 19 Democratic senators, and there were 56 Senate votes for the amendment, and there were 25 votes opposed. And so the amendment passes, and now begins the ratification process. Now, getting the House and the Senate to ratify this and actually send it to the states for ratification, now the real battle begins, because now 36 states are going to have to ratify this, and there will be another number of states against this. Carrie Chapman Catt of the National American Woman Suffrage Association and Alice Paul of the National Woman's Party, they galvanized their membership. And almost right away, in July, Montana, Arkansas, and Nebraska ratified the amendment. They will be followed. They will be followed by Texas. Texas, interesting. Texas will ratify the amendment, but as other states fall into line, Alabama and Georgia are the first states not to ratify the amendment. Again, southern states. The governor of Louisiana tried to organize 13 states not to vote for the amendment. Maryland, the Maryland legislature refused to ratify the amendment. Carrie Catt began appealing to Western governors, encouraging them to act more quickly. And by the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified the amendment. But again, the resistance to the amendment in states like Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Maryland, which, if you recall, was a border state in the Civil War, but had intense Southern sympathies. Now, interestingly enough, Tennessee will be the decided state here. You know, all these other states are eventually going to fall into line, but Tennessee is the state that really is the state that really gets this done. Now, interestingly enough, there were women who were not fans of having women have the right to vote. The National American Woman Suffrage Association and the National Woman's Party, they all descended in Tennessee. And as the state officials began to assemble to discuss and then hopefully ratify the amendment to make Tennessee the 36th state, those women who were generating support for the woman's right to vote were handing out yellow flowers to those representatives and senators who were going to vote for the women. Other women who were not fans of this were handing out red roses to those who were going to vote against on the railroad platform here. And so, interestingly enough, the Tennessee will narrowly ratify the 19th Amendment. And in the Tennessee House of Representatives, 50 of the 99 members voted yes. But the Senate had previously voted for it already. The Senate voted 24-5 in favor of ratification. One man here stands out, a representative. His name is Harry Byrne. He was a Republican. Now, he was in favor of the amendment. He was in favor of women getting the right to vote, but he believed some of his constituents were against it. And twice, even though he supported it, he voted against it. However, as the story goes here, supposedly his mother contacted him and urged him to vote yes, and he will. And so the amendment will pass. And on August 18, Tennessee narrowly approved the 19th Amendment, and that certificate, the certificate of amendment goes to the U.S. Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby. And at 4 o'clock in the morning on August 26, 1920, he certified the amendment, and it becomes the law of the land. Interestingly enough, as a side note here, by the time Tennessee had approved the amendment, Connecticut was actually the 37th state, not in one of the 36. We affirmed the amendment on September 14, 1920. Interesting, some of these states, when you look at the list, Maryland did not approve it until March 29, 1941, but they didn't certify it until February 25, 1958. Virginia did not ratify it until February 21, 1952. Alabama, September 8, 1953. Most of these states are southern states. Interesting here, but that's not the end of what's happening here with women. There were actions in individual states here. The Supreme Court, in a case called Lesser versus Garnett, Maryland was a holdout state. Two Maryland citizens, Mary D. Randolph, who was a black lady, and Celia Street Waters, a white woman, both from Baltimore. They applied for and were granted registration as qualified Baltimore voters on October 12, 1920. They wanted to vote in November. There were actions by a man by the name of Oscar Lesser and others who brought suit against these two women and didn't want women to vote. They were arguing that these ladies were not eligible to vote per the Constitution of Maryland, which had limited suffrage for men. The Maryland legislature refused to vote to ratify the 19th Amendment. However, the federal government, the Supreme Court, ruled against Maryland, that the 14th Amendment superseded the Maryland Constitution. And so these women will vote. Women's voting behavior. Interesting here when the women themselves, many of those in Congress thought that they were going to be they were going to be deluged with women voters here. That wasn't the case. Most women did not vote. However, newly enfranchised women and the women's groups began to prioritize certain legislation. One of them was the Shepard-Towner Act. Now, this is an interesting piece of social legislation. Whereas whereas groups prioritize the agenda rather than party loyalty in the goal of the Shepard-Towner Act. But here, many Republicans will get involved with this. It is the first federal Social Security Act. And what this did was, the Shepard-Towner Act was for maternity and infancy protection in 1921. But that expired in 1929, same year as the Depression. The African women's suffrage movement, they faced a different problem. Even down south, just like black men, they were having a tough time to vote. Ballot boxes, maybe the places to vote were miles away from where they lived. Poll taxes. Black men were going through the same sort of thing. Literacy restrictions, which is really against the Constitution. It's against the Constitution. However, keep in mind what you're also seeing here with these black women, that many are joining the NAACP to strengthen the NAACP. And as I mentioned in my Eleanor Roosevelt talks, you will begin to see, as Republicans becoming more and more conservative, leaving the blacks will, in the 1930s, and Eleanor Roosevelt will be a big booster of this, the black constituency will move from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. But by 1920, with the passing of the 19th Amendment, women have the right to vote. But again, as you see here in the beginnings, 1920, only 36% of eligible women turned out to vote, as opposed to 68% of men. But it's not really until the 1960s when women really begin to turn out to vote. And if you're familiar with the numbers, with the last presidential election in 2016, you see here that 53% of women actually voted for Donald Trump. 53% of those women who did vote voted for Trump, as opposed to Hillary, who if had won that election, would have been the first woman president. That we haven't had yet. Another aspect of this to come out of, another thing that came out of the women's right to vote, the League of Women Voters. 6 months after the 19th Amendment was ratified, Emma Smith DeVoe, Carrie Chapman Catt were agreed to merge the National Women's Suffrage Association and the National Council of Women Voters and help put together the League of Women Voters, which now has over 1,000 locals in 50 states. Interesting where this is going. And to conclude here, when you begin to see how this is fared in the last 100 years, Congress. There are 127 members of Congress who are women. Out of 535 seats, 127 are held by women. 26 are senators, 101 are in the House of Representatives. Statewide executives, 9 governors are women, 15 are lieutenant governors, and 66 otherwise statewide elected officials, such as secretaries of state, so on and so forth. That's 90 women who take part in doing this. State legislatures throughout the country. There are a total of 7,383 seats in 50 states in their houses of representatives. Out of those 7,383, 2,146 are women. Out of 1,972 state Senate seats, 515 are actually held by women. And out of the 100 largest cities in the country, 27 have female mayors. So women have come a long, long way since 1920, but also since 1865, when you see the split in the women's movement. If anybody has any questions, they may ask them now.
Okay, Mark, I'm just gonna give this a couple minutes. The YouTube stream is a little bit on a delay, so I will
Oh,
give
okay.
us a minute. If anyone has any questions that they want to add to the chat box. Okay, we just got one in. And here we go. Was the decision to push the Black vote ahead of the women's right to vote strictly political on behalf of the Republican Party?
Yeah, the Republicans were looking to, I mean, keep in mind at this point, the Republicans know that the three-fifths compromise in the Constitution is now dead. That three-fifths compromise, when the country was put together, since there were more people living up north than there were down south, to make sure that the South stayed in the government, stayed in the country, they were able, the Southern representatives to the House were able to count three-fifths of black slaves towards representation in Congress. Now they're counting, out of about 660,000 blacks, over 400,000 will be counted as voters, yet they can't vote. But that's over and done with after 1865. And so the Southerners do not want black men voting, but the Republicans do. And the Republicans can pad their voting reservoir here by having black men vote Republican. And so a lot of this is political. A lot of this is political, like almost everything else is. Next question.
So far, that is all we have. I'll give it another minute in case anyone has anything that they want to ask. Oh, one just came in.
Sure.
Was the overall reason for opposition to ratify the women's vote sheer misogyny, political in nature, or financial in nature?
Probably in certain respects, all the above. You've had male dominance in this country ever since it was formed, and ever since before it was formed. It's hard to give up power. When someone has power, it's hard to give it up. Women, and justifiably so, they're citizens too. The 14th Amendment really should have been a lead-in for not only the black man the right to vote, but a universal amendment, as Stanton and Anthony wanted. It should have made no difference whether you're black, you're white, you're man or woman. If you're a citizen here, if you're born here, or you're naturalized, you're a citizen, you should have a right to take part politically. But again, there will be people, no matter what kind of society you have, no matter what type of political structure you have, who are going to want to dominate. And that's part of the issue here, on top of other things, other aspects like the distillers and the brewers who thought that if women got the right to vote, there would be the prohibition of alcohol, or the clothing manufacturers who thought, using cheap child labor, if women get the right to vote, that access to such cheap labor will be finished. And so you're going to have people, and of course, all that's going to fail, but you are going to have people who are going to throw roadblocks into women getting the right to vote because they don't want to give up their privileged position. And so everything is a struggle. Despite the fact we have a constitution, despite the fact we have a Bill of Rights, people in this country had to struggle to get the right to vote. They had to struggle to get equal rights. They had to struggle for economic freedom. We know that. It's in our history. So there will always be somebody who's going to want to try to dominate.
Okay. Okay. That looks like all of the questions for now. So thank you, Mark, for coming on this Monday afternoon. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. And I think
And
that
also,
is
and
all
also
that
too,
we have.
if and people can also contact me direct too if they have any additional questions.
Okay. That sounds good.
All righty.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything you want to
Okay.
add, Pat?
Are we off of YouTube?
Oh, I'm going to stop the YouTube now.